Hey everybody, I'm going to try to make this as painless as possible. This is going to be the architecture lecture for the Art of Storytelling, CNMA 1305. Let's get started. So when we talk about stories in architecture, we're talking about a couple of different possibilities here. There are architecture styles like complete artifice, honorary artifice, interactive artifice, aesthetic artifice, and historical norms, and then, of course, historical narrative. We're going to cover each one of these a little more in depth. So, let's start with complete artifice. It's architecture that's completely fake and from which the audience maintains an aesthetic distance. So, there's nothing about it that's real. There's nothing about it that is interactive or true necessarily, but it's meant to be appreciated from a distance. It usually involves things like scenery, visual design elements that are still part of regular architecture but are there completely for the visual effect, and it's usually done in a controlled environment. The styles range from very, very realistic to completely suggestive and abstract. Let's take this set, for example. This is a set in a theater, and you can tell because if you look over at the left side of the screen, there's the front row of seats. Look at the detail in this set, though. Look at the bottom of the counter where people's feet would kick against this donut shop's counter. That's the kind of thing that would be there if people had been coming to a very real donut shop for years and years and years. Look at the light switch over by the front door, over on the left side, the stage right side, and there's grubbiness sort of around the switch and up the wall and by the air conditioner. There's some unbuilt boxes over next to the soda cooler. Everything about this set smacks of realism, as though like it's a real place and you could go there and just walk right in and feel completely at home in a real donut shop. Same thing goes for this set. Yeah, it's a set on a stage in a theater, but it's the size of a full house, and they've gone to the trouble of bringing in either very realistic looking or very real tree branches. They've done a lot to mimic the light from a street light to make sure that the roof of the building is lit. All the texture and design work, the rocks and the gravel on the ground, every little element of this is meant to not be enjoyed up close, but to be enjoyed from a distance so that you can appreciate all of the aesthetic values without actually getting to be in its presence. Then there's this set, which again is a set on a theater stage. Now they've gone to great length to make sure that there's a lot of realistic detail on this set. The neon signs, the general distressing, the black top. If you look at the bottom of the staircase, there's actually a vehicle that they brought in and put on the set. All the little details are there, all the way up to the satellite dish on the roof. But again, if you look up in the top right-hand corner, you can see the light reflecting off of stage lighting. And that's one of the only clues that are in this set to let you know that it is a set, that it's not real, but it's really, really working hard to steep you in that realism. Now there are sets that are suggestive. Just take a second and look at this set. Look and see what you see. Observe what you observe. So, all down the sides are these louvered shutters, right? And then they've mirrored that same sort of louvered effect going across the top. Those are called teasers. Anything that goes horizontally across the top of a set is either called a border or a teaser. And then things that run vertically on the side of the stage to obscure your sight lines, those are called tormentors or legs. So you can see this set is incredibly suggestive, but think about what just these visual lines make you think of. There's the louvered shutters, there's the scroll ironwork in the sign, there's a palm tree, again, another tree on a set. There's a palm tree, and then there's sort of wicker, ornate, patio-style furniture, and a vendor cart selling lemonade. This to me has a very island feel, and the pink coloration mixed with the sort of fuchsia tones on the front really help highlight that. Like it's a sunset or sunrise in an island location. But the style of the tables and chairs and the height of the louvers let me know that it's some sort of resort or hotel or something that's a little more upscale. What's interesting about this set then, because it's so minimalist and because it's just suggesting things, it only takes a few minor changes to give it a very different feel. Now, it's the same furniture, but it also works in this sort of indoor space, which is clearly a bar like at the hotel. The louvered shutters on the sides now open to allow for more entrances and exits, giving doorways, which also suggest interior. The windows now that have been flown in the back, and then all the lighting, all the spherical globes that are floating in the sky. It's really interesting to me on this set how just basic, simple lighting changes make a world of difference in the feel and in the location and in the suggestion of all that. Now we're back out to that same exterior, but instead of being front lit, now it's backlit. Now what we have is dark broodiness, sort of a sepia tone. Even the tree looks more dead. Everything just seems more dead. But now is a great time for you to look at this set and realize a couple of other things. Something's not right in this world, right? Something's off kilter. Something is incorrect. Because if you look at the flooring, everything is sloping. Everything is angular. Everything is just off of horizontal. Nothing is quite straight. Nothing is quite perfect in the way that we need it to be. Even this little detail helps give us the suggestion and the sense of not only the world and the location, but the feeling and the action and the dramatic action of what's going on in this story. Now we're back to the bar, but with the globes being a little more lit up, it gives it just a very different feel, right? So I could cut back to this one where it's front lit and it has more of a neutral feel, a natural feel. But now I go to this where it's backlit and it gives it more of that broody, that darkness, that undertone, the fact that we can't see exactly what's facing us and there is something that's there being obscured. Now we go to the completely abstract. Take a second and drink this in. Look at the size of the people on the stage. You can tell that that's the proper scale because of the audience that's down at the very bottom of the frame. There's just so many things going on here that are strange to us that it's like nothing we've ever seen before. Usually when we think of a stage, we'll think of a space like this, where it's contained, there's a proscenium arch, we sit here, they sit there, but everything is on solid ground. Here, the stage is literally floating on the water, and it's giant. Now, take a look at this, and just drink this in, and think for a moment about what this story could be about. What is the circle of paper triangles? Some people would say it looks like a paper boat. To me, it looks like a crown. And now, what is this book? There's this giant, massive book that's floating in the water, but what kind of book is it? Well, if you look closely, you can see that those are footprints, and what it's detailing here is a dance. So we have a dance and a crown, which represents power. So this could be a play or an opera about the tangled dances that we weave in order to try to achieve power. And the whole time, the entire thing is being overseen by death, represented by a giant skeleton coming up out of the water, overseeing this whole thing. Pretty cool, right? It's intriguing, it's aesthetically pleasing, it's compelling, and it helps give you a sense of what's going on in this story. Now, same space, completely different set now. It still has the grandioseness of its scale. It still has this relationship with water, but now it's a very, very different kind of set. Same thing again. Now we do have a paper boat that's floating around in the water. This is a table, and it's filled with postcards, and it's got some chairs around it. There's one that's upside down in the distance. We have a sense of scale. We have a sense of things continuing on past this present world. We have an ashtray. Has a very Vegas feel to me. Has a very fun atmosphere, and yet you can also get the sense that there is something else going on. There is something going on behind the scenes. This has to be one of my favorite. Because is this rural or urban? Great, urban. Is this organized or chaotic? Well, it feels to me like there's supposed to be order and there's supposed to be cohesiveness, but things are bent, things are twisted, things are not the way they're meant to be. Is it dead or alive? Well, the grayness and the order and the grid gives a very dead feeling, and yet there are these green emerald pipes sticking out of the top that give a sense of like there's life being contained inside this death. Take a second, really look at it. Observe the fire escapes. Observe the little plain space that's upstage center. Observe that the building, even though it's laying down and people are walking on the side of it, there are still lights on in the rooms underneath. There's life inside, but things are bent and twisted and aren't what they're supposed to be. Now this is probably one of the cooler sets that I've ever been able to observe. This is the set from the Ring Cycle that was done at the Met in New York. It's really just one giant wall with all of those elongated diamond-shaped individual beams that can be rotated around the central axis and controlled individually. Then what they would do is, through the use of lighting and projection and guided projection, create different and unique spaces, actual physical spaces and colors and shapes, using just these simple building blocks. Here they are expressing an orderliness, and the patterns that are projected on them are orderly and organic, and everything is in the same sort of warm, neutral color palette. Here it's representing the deepness of water. And if you see the actresses and the opera singers who are acting in front of it are suspended from wires, and they're floating around in front of this giant projection wall. One really cool detail to notice is that from each of these singers, because they're underwater, they've projected bubbles coming up from their mouths as they sing. Now, what was really cool about this particular production is they then matched the bubble projections to each of those actresses' microphones. So the louder they sang, the more bubbles they came out. And then when they would stop singing, the bubbles would stop coming out. You get this sense of a space, an abstract space, an idea about journeying and traveling and light into dark and dark into light. But I don't know of any other way to create this kind of actual 3D dimensional visual without having an abstract communicative space. Our next kind of artifice is called honorary artifice, and it's architecture that has been built to elicit a specific sense of remembrance. We build things to help us remember things. It's designed to safely immerse the viewer in the experience it represents or the consequences of the experience it represents. You need to be able to remember something without having to actually live through it again. But there are things that have been traumatic, that have been tragic, that have been awful, that we need to remember so that we don't repeat them without having to re-experience that trauma over again. This is one in particular that many people of our generation tend to forget. This is the Vietnam Memorial. And you can see from the aerial shot that it's a big, big gash in the earth. And people can come and walk by it. But then when you look at the other image, you can see sort of the sense of scale. What it is many, many slabs of black granite into which the names of every person who died or went missing in the war has had their name engraved. The other thing about it is that it's really highly polished, so that not only can you go and see the names and remember those people who went and served and died, but you also then see a reflection of yourself, so that you are simultaneously reminded of what happened and the vast, vast cost of what happened, but also the reason why it happened. They died for you. And the place where you come to visit them is where they are. It's underground.
It comes as no surprise that America's most controversial war was shrouded in debate as to how it should be commemorated. Critics believe that unlike monuments for other wars, the Vietnam Wall is not celebratory and is more mournful than heroic. The blackness of the granite contrasts sharply with the bright white monuments around Washington. Those who dislike the color associate the blackness of the wall with the deep objection the majority of Americans had for the war. Veteran John J. Callahan claims it's a black scar in the ground, and Vietnam is a black scar in this country. In response to the criticism, the Three Soldiers statue was added to give the memorial a more traditional, heroic theme. Despite all the criticism, the monument is a favorite of many Americans and veterans, and has over 3 million visitors a year.
I feel like this painting does a really good job of representing what a visit to this memorial can be. Here's another site that, for many of us, is much more recent and fresh in our minds. It's the site of the Twin Towers in New York City that fell on 9/11. From the sky, again, you can see that it's great big giant holes in the ground. And on the anniversary of the attack, great shafts of light are shot up into the sky from the memorial in the places where the towers once stood. And I think it's a really, really smart way to represent the spirit of a building that used to be there and that no longer is. We're going to watch a video here about this experience and about some of the design elements and details that went into creating a space that you can physically walk in, physically be present in, and be reminded of the things that are important about that day.
The tragedy of September 11, 2001 changed New York and the people of the United States forever. The 9/11 Memorial is one of New York's newest and most solemn sites, and among the most visited. Chosen from over 5,200 entries submitted by teams in 63 nations, the memorial design includes 2 reflecting pools that sit within the footprint of the World Trade Center's Twin Towers. Each pool covers nearly an acre. Bronze panels with the names of everyone who died in the 2001 and 1993 attacks surround the pools, reminding visitors of the human cost of 9/11. The terrorist attacks on that single day caused the largest loss of life from a foreign attack on American soil, and the greatest single loss of first responders in American history. The largest man-made waterfall in North America fills the air with the soothing sound of cascading water. The museum at the site explores the significance of 9/11 and celebrates an unwavering commitment to the value of human life. One World Trade Center is the leading building of the new World Trade Center complex. It has been constructed with a spire reaching a symbolic 1,776 feet in reference to the year of American independence. The new complex will also feature 3 other high-rise office buildings. One key symbol of the memorial is a calorie pear tree called the Survivor Tree. It was recovered from the World Trade Center site in October 2001, long after recovery workers expected to find anything alive. At the time of recovery, it was badly burned and had only one living branch. Over the years, its continued survival has turned the tree into a powerful symbol of hope and rebirth.
And in an instant, I became a New Yorker. I felt a tremendous sense of kinship. That attack was aimed at me and my neighbors and my friends, and it all of us together. And it brought the city together in a remarkable way. But if you would have told me a week before that I would go out, buy an American flag, and hang it from my window, I would have said, I don't think so. And I felt compelled to do that. And it changed my understanding of my relationship to New York and to America. This is the built equivalent of a moment of silence, this idea of absence, of making visible and present what is no longer here. Think of these sort of narrow urban canyons and emerging from them, like emerging out of the mouth of a narrow valley onto this vast open plain and encountering this unexpected forest, close to 400 oak trees, and walking across the street. And I think the moment that you step onto the Memorial Plaza, you will feel that you're in a place that is both in New York but unlike the rest of New York.
So which streets are going to go through? Is Liberty here that we're on?
We're walking west right now on Liberty Street.
Well, you'll be able to just walk down Liberty Street and enter.
Right, yeah, exactly. The challenge for us was to try and get a very clear and strong visual effect with a minimum amount of water. Think of like the water coming out of a garden hose, and imagine a few hundred of them all in a row, one after another after another. And as that water falls down, about halfway down that 30-foot fall, the clarity of those individual strands dissipates and is lost, and the water becomes this much more diffuse tapestry. And I think there's something quite beautiful about that. That was not sort of an a priori intention, but I saw something in it that I wanted to embrace, which was this notion of both individual loss and this collective identity.
And here we are at the South
Pole, yeah. I mean, look up and you see the sky. And the balance for me was not to sort of step aside and disassociate ourselves from the city, but to create something that was both in and of the city, but also an opportunity to sort of look at the city that surrounds us in a different light. So we're actually standing within the tower footprint, and defining that envelope is done here as quietly with the location of the trees. So we didn't want to sort of put a marker on the ground or sort of a line that said here it was, but we at the same time wanted to find a way to acknowledge that.
Did you always imagine the trees would be in this sort of strict grid?
If you look to the east or west, you see them sort of snapping into these beautiful long LAs. But if you look north and south, that order completely
Well, they get more
dissipates.
random.
What's interesting to me is, as you stand even a few feet away from this void, you don't really sense it. And it's not until you're right up at the very edge that it seems to open up right under you. It's something that you feel right in your gut.
Exactly.
And it's going to be a very powerful moment, that moment of first arriving at the edge of this void and encountering the names.
So you can see a great deal of thought and intentionality went into creating a physical space that has an emotional impact to help remind you, even subtly, even in ways that once you experience it, you wouldn't necessarily be able to put into words or know that it had an intentional effect, but you would definitely walk away with a visceral feeling, a physical feeling of the space having communicated things to you. Next is interactive artifice. And so this is architecture that's meant to draw the audience in by means of interaction and immersion. So in some ways, it's fake like complete artifice, where it's meant to be transportive, but you get to jump in. It means you get to be immersive. You can actually participate. Now, this can only hint at reality because it needs to leave the audience comfortable to be able to enjoy it. Something like this, which is downtown USA, right? This is the main street in Disneyland where obviously the architecture has been meant to transport you back to a time in history when many people feel like it's the golden age of America and things were simpler and jobs were plentiful and everyone was able to jump into these shops and buy sweet treats and do these things. And yet, obviously, you're not time traveling. And obviously, they've only picked the nicer, cleaner, better elements of this era. There isn't, segregation. There isn't all of the political messiness. There isn't all of this ideological messiness. There isn't this struggle for suffrage. They don't want to talk about that, and they don't want to highlight that because they want you to have a good time. And so they've created something that is like a historical norm that has all the affectations and trappings of that, but without all the ugliness. Same thing with Legoland. Obviously, you can't jump into the Las Vegas Strip and go and touch all the buildings and play with these Legos the way you could as a kid, but it is meant to transport you to a place where you remember playing with Legos and you remember building things out of them. And then to see them on this kind of scale is mind-boggling and makes you nostalgic for a time when you did create things like what you'd hoped would turn into something like this. And the same thing goes for Disney World and medieval times. These aren't actual castles. No one would want to go to an actual castle where there is no heating and cooling and there is no plumbing and there's the plague and there's more manure and there's actual death and servitude and all of these other things. Nobody wants that. But we want to interact with a space that makes us feel like we get to enjoy and be immersed in just the good parts of that era. Next is aesthetic artifice. It's also known as narrative architecture, and this is probably the one that is going to seem the least familiar to most of us, but it's also one that affects us the most in our daily lives. Narrative architecture evolves from an introspective exploration of the client's mission and passion. Basically, what this is saying is that narrative architecture is about making sure that who the building is for is reflective of how it's built, so that what the building's owner does, what they do, what they stand for, what they mean, what they do in the world is reflected in the building that encases them. This is the Palazzo Farnese, built in 1517 in Italy. It's designed by Antonio di an Italian dude. In 1534, in January, Cardinal Alessandro became Pope Paul III, and the size of the palace was increased significantly. He employed Michelangelo, who completed the redesigned third story with its deep cornice, and he revised the courtyard as well. What you need to know is that the post-1534 developments were not only a reflection of his change in status, but they employed architecture to express the power of his family. Think about it. This guy was a cardinal. He had this great family home, which overtook the courtyard of the city, and you can see, people walking about, milling about, and realize once he became pope, he decided that the architecture of his home needed to reflect his increased stature and his increased control, meaning that not only was the building not tall enough, it didn't stick out over the courtyard enough to let people know who was really in charge. And you can see that even the height of each floor, so the first two floors are pretty standard heights, but the third floor got even higher and employed more of the hand-carved molding and more decorative elements in the structure. The other thing that aesthetic artifice does, though, is it doesn't just employ these sort of physical techniques to communicate our strength and position, but architects have been employing these techniques for centuries to point out the height and the glory and the grandeur of God. Gothic chapel architecture was designed to draw the eye skyward in reverence of God. So before the pointed arches of the Gothic architectural era, rounded arches were what was used to create these spaces. And the thing about the pointed arches and the rounded arches is that the rounded arches couldn't carry as much weight and strength at greater heights. Once they put a point on them, they realized they could go higher and higher and higher and push the limits of what the materials could withstand. Now, one of the other architectural techniques that comes out of this era, that is my second favorite word, is buttresses. And buttresses are these extensions of the building that stick out beyond the building and go down to the ground and help the building get taller. Some of the missions here in Texas actually employ this very technique. So in order to create a chapel that was larger and had a higher domed roof, they had parts of the building stick out beyond it, and those are called buttresses. Now, the level of technology developed and even advanced, which brought out my actual favorite word, which is flying buttresses. So these support pillars and these support piers would then stack upon each other outside the building in order to allow the sort of great height that they were able to achieve inside these chapels, which again was all designed to draw the eye skyward. Now, here's an interesting building. And what do you notice about this building? What do you observe about this building? Is it the same color as all the buildings around it? No. Does it have the sort of fancy stair-step entrance like the other buildings around it? No. In fact, the Seagram's building, designed by Mies van der Rohe, conveys a sense of solidity of the Seagram's Corporation. They said, we want a building that stands out from all the other buildings around us, that says we're not fancier, we're not flashier, but we don't need to be. So it's all straight lines, and it's all condensed into one single cube. But what it communicates and what it conveys is, we've been around forever and we haven't chased fads. We don't need to. I think this is a really, really effective use of aesthetic artifice. Now, it isn't always effectively used. Take, for example, the Denver airport. Now, what you need to know is there are a couple of things about the Denver airport. First of all, it's not in Denver. It's outside of Denver, and it's in a mountain valley surrounded by the Rocky Mountains. It's at a great altitude. And what the architect wanted to do was to create a sort of aesthetic artifice that mirrored the surroundings of the airport. This is supposed to be mirroring and representing the Rocky Mountains. But to me, it just sort of represents a circus village and a bunch of big top tents. So I've never really been sold on the idea that it was an effective use of aesthetic architecture and artifice. This one, though, is fascinating to me. This is the Williams and Thiessen's Neurosciences building in La Jolla, California. And what I feel like this architecture does is it conveys both the rigidity and normalcy and measurability of activity in the brain, along with the organic and unpredictable nature of neurosciences. So there are a lot of straight lines, a lot of geometric shapes, a lot of repeated patterns, and yet in many, many places they seem to be at odds with each other. The lines don't quite line up. Things aren't quite parallel. And when you realize that it sits on top of a hill, just like the brain sits on top of a body, and it embraces some of the more organic elements of the world, you realize that this building really does a phenomenal job of embracing aesthetic artifice. In the same way, the Getty Center, which is a giant art museum in Los Angeles, it embraces its environment and it embraces shape and design in such a way that it leads you to a place where you can more readily take in art and appreciate it in an environment that is suited and designed specifically for that. So looking at the outline of the building and the way it's laid out on the ground from above, you can see that the way everyone enters the building grounds is on a tram that comes up here. There's a couple of reasons for this. A, at the top of the mountain, they just didn't have the space for a parking lot. B, it makes it a lot easier to steal valuable works of art if you can just run out and hop in your car and drive away down the freeway. So by making every visitor and every guest take a tram up, it helps the museum regulate the flow of humans. Once you get here, your eye is drawn and you are led to enter up these sets of stairs. And what's really important for you to realize is that, yes, there are other places for you to go once you get off the tram, but this is where they want you to go, and so this is where the building is designed to draw you in. Running through the campus are a couple of straight lines, and you'll see that even this fountain is split in half by this line. And it runs straight down this fountain, straight onto the building, and right into the main rotunda. Everything in the museum runs off this central line, and it's important for you to realize that this isn't a mistake. What you're brought back to is this central flow in the building that allows you to then depart to the left or the right to go into these different exhibits, but when you come out, you've got a much stronger sense of where you are and where you've been. Keeping a single long line like that helps avoid confusion, unlike, say, a shopping mall, which usually runs in a spur, so that yes, there are main avenues, but oftentimes it's hard to remember which way you came in and which way you went out and where your vehicle is. It's designed to create confusion so that you stay longer and keep shopping.
It takes you away from your everyday world, from the traffic, from the smog and everything. It elevates us out of that. It's just, wow, am I in heaven?
I love that the art at the Getty is always changing. Once you think you've seen everything, then they bring in new exhibits.
Every time I come, it's a new experience.
I actually get a different view of not only the museum, but of the world.
Welcome to the Getty Museum. It's a place to explore, a place to be inspired, a place to see and to discover. The Getty is home to one of the most dynamic and unique art organizations in the world. It all began in 1954. when oilman J. Paul Getty opened a museum in his ranch house in Malibu, giving the people of Los Angeles a unique place to look at and be enriched by art. As the collection grew, Getty built a new museum in the style of a Roman villa to house it. Today, the Getty Villa in Malibu showcases the museum's collection of Greek, Roman, and Etruscan antiquities. After 13 years of design and construction, the Getty expanded from its home at the Getty Villa into a second location on this beautiful campus designed by architect Richard Meyer. Meyer's stunning architecture was designed with great precision, carefully drawing your eye to interesting and sometimes surprising views. The Central Garden, designed by California artist Robert Irwin, is a sculpture in the form of a garden. It was commissioned by the Getty and is part of the museum's permanent collection. The Getty Museum's continually growing collection at the Getty Center is home to European paintings, drawings, sculpture, illuminated manuscripts, decorative arts, and photographs from all over the world.
What stands out to you in contrast?
Lots of brush strokes. Much more detail in the woman's face than the man's.
There's a great power in observing anything. When people come, they bring their own context or their own meaning to the art. They speak to the art, and art speaks back to them. You've got a perfect dialogue.
The Getty is a place for dialogue, with art, and with the art world. Through relationships with organizations all over the world, the Getty Museum brings an array of artworks to its galleries for changing exhibitions, some shared for the first time ever outside their home countries. The exhibition design process brings together a number of departments at the museum.
Every gallery has a 1-inch scale model that we work on. We go into the model, placing the objects so that we can figure out spacing, visitor flow, what objects go next to which, and the overall color and any other design ideas that we'll need to prepare for.
Starting with the curator's vision, a wide range of staff work together to create dozens of critically acclaimed temporary exhibitions every year. The museum also presents exciting public programs which allow visitors to deepen their experience of the exhibitions. As well as being an exceptional museum, the Getty is a leader in working to understand and preserve our cultural heritage, both in LA and all over the globe. The Getty Conservation Institute brings together art, science, and related fields in its work to advance the practice of conservation throughout the world. In China, a Getty Conservation Institute team helped develop ways to preserve and protect 1,000-year-old cave paintings.
That's a very small trace just there.
This figure is quite interesting because there's a whole sequence of building up these figures.
Getty conservation professionals are part scholar, scientist, artist, and detective, as they seek ways to preserve the diversity of art that forms our common cultural heritage. The Getty Research Institute is one of the world's most important art libraries, where scholars from all over the world work to better understand art and the life and times of the artists who created it.
Paris a disparu. Okay, so there are lots of references to Paris and parts of Paris, but not always necessarily nostalgic.
Look at what an amazing silhouette of the Eiffel Tower that has just been built just around this time. And we have the photographs here in special collection of the construction of the Eiffel Tower.
The Getty Research Institute also creates changing exhibitions offering visitors a window into rare and exciting moments in art history. The Getty Foundation's philanthropy supports the work of scholars and conservators in more than 175 countries. Their work helps to preserve and showcase our diverse cultural heritage on every continent around the world. And right here in Los Angeles. The Getty. From breathtaking works of art and architecture to profound works of art scholarship and preservation. This is a place for exploration and discovery. A home for imagination and inspiration. And you are welcome to explore. This is the Getty.
Now I want to talk about some of the historical norms in architecture. Architecture is absolutely reflective of and driven by the time in which it's created. It's going to reflect the history, the culture, the taste, the politics, nature, religion. It's going to reflect all of these things. It has a tendency to trend, and because of that, we can, just by looking at a piece of architecture to within a variable degree of success, place the time when it was designed and built. You can see that many architectural norms have long shelf lives and can go for hundreds and hundreds of years. However, the more modern we get, the faster change happens. Now we have dozens of historical norms in architecture happening within just a short 10-year span. Let me give you some examples. What can you tell about the values of the society that built this space? There's immaculate woodwork. There's a celebration of the natural resources. There's a celebration of knowledge. Now, sure, it's a library, so I might be bending and skewing it a little bit. But look at the kinds of materials that are placed in this library outside of just the books. Sculptures, things made of stone, brass, electrical light, and look at the number of spindles in the staircases, and realize that there weren't computerized machines that could make these back then. These were all hand-turned. Notice too the material that it's made out of. These darker woods, these walnuts, these old-growth hardwoods. These aren't as readily available these days. Although walnuts currently, in the last, say, 5 or 6 years, made a bit of a comeback in popularity. It's not the old-growth groves that we've had before. Obviously, most of those have been harvested. And so architecture like this is rare, not only because of the way it's done and when it was done, but it's going to tell you more about the materials available when it was built. All right, drink in this room, if you can. It's very busy. There's a lot going on, but I'm going to point out some things to you. Notice all the rich upholstery. Look at all the floral print, not just on the upholstery, but also on the wallpapers. The wallpaper features exotic plants, birds even. There are ferns and palm fronds all throughout the room. Pedestals that feature only vases. A privacy screen that obviously came from Asia. All kinds of rich textures. There's an elephant sculpture over the mantelpiece. This is a room done in the Victorian style, and you can tell by the height of the room, the heaviness of the curtains, the size and weight of the crown molding and the way that it's carved, and then the celebration of all of the natural textures and exotic locations. This was a time of vast and rapid global exploration, and people were going out into all different kinds of the worlds and bringing back treasures from distant lands, and people in the upper middle class and in the wealthy society were celebrating these things. And so these things are going to be put about and added into the architecture and into the layouts of the rooms as a celebration of what's going on in the world. Now check out this room. Opulent, palatial, very tall ceilings, lots of gold and white, lots of ornate carvings on the tops and the bottoms of the columns, lots of ornate design and intricate work in the floor, lots of natural light and lots of artificial light. Look down at the far end of the room, and you'll see that there's a throne. This is a throne room. So everything about this room leads your eye down toward the end where the monarch sits and is raised above literally everything else in the room except the ceilings. This is going to tell you something about what the society values, what the owner of this room and of this building value. Now check out this building. I want you to notice the repetition of straight geometric lines that happen in decreasing spacing. So even at the lowest portion of the building, you can see that there are these long, tall, straight lines that run to its height. And then the next highest portion of the building is just a little bit taller, but for about half the length. And then again, and then again. This step and repeat version of architecture is known as Art Deco. And the other thing that you'll notice about Art Deco is that it's going to feature a lot of, again, sort of things in nature, plants, fruits, things of that nature. You can see that a lot in a lot of buildings, like the Chrysler Building, where you've got the concentric circles that sort of spill up and get longer and longer and smaller, eventually ending in a spire. Same thing with the lobby of the same building, the repeated yet slightly larger or slightly smaller geometric shapes. Now we have a different style that we're looking at here. Many of us are going to get a natural sense of when architecture like this came into being. Notice the full-length windows, the straight lines, the emphasis on clean geometry, circles, arcs, straight lines, triangles, cones, things of that nature. The furniture is going to give you a real sense of the era as well. The curved shapes, the natural materials blending with man-made materials, a focus on texture and not just color and shape. This isn't from the 50s. I know it might seem like it or it might feel like it, but that's the idea. If it was truly from the 50s, I think it wouldn't be quite so clean and we wouldn't have quite the intentionality in the color palette. This is what's known as mid-century modern. So there's a whole style of architecture in which people like to, again, harken back to a time, but without actually going there. So in some ways, historical norms can be a form of narrative artifice. Now compare this piece to this space. It's all straight, clean lines, very few curves. And the designer may have been hesitant to put some in, and so he said, fine, we'll just put in a couple of vases and a couple of bowls, but that's it. Everything else is in straight lines. All dominated by gray, black, and white, with only one accent color, and boy is that bright. Other historical norms are going to come out. I mentioned it briefly when we were looking at that library, but here's another one. Hammer beam roof lines. Hammer beam arches, as you can see, sort of hearken unto the Gothic arch, where it's not just the straight Roman curve, but it comes to a bit of a point. Now what's interesting about hammer beams is that they are buttressed, but not from the outside, from the inside. What kind of geographic locations do you think feature this sort of architecture? Well, let me cut to the chase. It's mostly Nordic. Up north, in Scandinavia, they need really steep roof lines. Why would the Norse people require steep roof lines? Well, because of the monumental amount of snow that they get. If you have a flatter roof, your building is going to bear the weight of all that snow, which is fine if you just get a light dusting. But if you get into the 3 and 4 foot depths of snow, that could get dangerous. So they needed these steep roof lines. But the other thing that they didn't have was incredibly tall trees. And so if you look at these hammer beams, you'll see that they were able to achieve much longer runs, much steeper roofs, without long pieces of wood. And so this happened in a time when the timber available didn't come in long runs. So they were able to creatively come up with the same sort of architectural needs that they could have done if they'd had long timber, but doing it with shorter, smaller pieces of wood. The last thing I want to talk about after historical norms is the historical narrative. It's the actual history that architecture tells us about. You can look at a building and know the events that happened in that place and time. I want to talk to you about Dunluce Castle in County Antrim in Northern Ireland. Dunluce Castle is one of my favorite places in the whole wide world. Ireland is currently divided between the Republic of Ireland in the south and then a small chunk of the country up north, which still belongs to the United Kingdom. But historically, the island itself was its own nation. And sure, it had lots of different counties and areas ruled over by lords, but the seat of power over the entire island used to be this castle for 600 years. Now let that sink in. This castle was the capital of the nation for 3 times longer than we have even been a country. This is a shot looking at the castle from the land side. Now, I say that because what you need to know about Dunluce Castle is that it's built on a pedestal that goes out to sea. Here it is from the other side of the wall, still on the mainland side. So in order for an invading army to attack this castle and take it over, they would have to come down a hill, and then they get funneled into this narrow point by these 2 rock walls, which led to a bridge, which obviously the people in the castle would raise. So not only would they be easy pickings on this hillside from the castle, they'd have to then somehow bridge the gap over to the pedestal. Then once they got there, there was a massive tall tower and gate that they had to try to breach as well. This sort of architecture is going to really make it impossible to overcome, making this the perfect spot to claim power. Now, other things I want you to look at. What we have here are a couple of examples of different architectural styles. Here, we've got rounded Roman arches over these windows. But here, we have pane windows made out of stone and more modern brickwork. This is going to give you the sense of Roman arch to Gothic arch to not even arches at all, how long this building has been in existence. Other parts of this story are this part of the castle. To the left, you see one of the walls of the building, and to your right is a railing, because half of the building fell off into the ocean. Long after it had been the seat of power, it had been taken over by a lord, and he and his wife lived there, and she absolutely despised living there because it was cold, and it was out on the ocean, and she just hated it. Then one night, the kitchen and a bunch of the servants literally fell off into the ocean, and that's when she said, "That's it, I've had it, we're not staying here anymore." It has since fallen into disrepair and has been taken over by the state and is a tourist attraction. This historical narrative also stands as a memorial. The one thing that made this castle the perfect seat of power also was its weakness. And now, what used to be the capital of an entire nation is a tourist trap where for €5 you can go walk around and take pictures with a pile of rocks. The last narrative from this architecture that I want to talk about is about one of the lords who lived here. At the bottom of this pedestal, there's actually a small cave, and there's a series of tunnels that lead down to this cave. And what they kept in this cave was an escape boat. So the lord and his family heard that an invading army was coming, and what he did was he sent his wife and his children down, and they got in the boat, and they sailed away to an island that's about 9 miles away from the castle. What this Lord didn't know is that his enemies knew about this escape boat and knew about their escape plan. And the Lord stood in this impenetrable fortress of security and watched from 10 miles off as his entire family was captured, killed, and burned. So what is the historical narrative of our architecture today? Well, I would ask you to consider the humble retail space. Buildings are made now of concrete slabs, steel frames, and then prefabricated concrete panels that are simply lifted into a place and attached to the buildings. Why do we build this way? Well, because it's incredibly strong and it's incredibly cheap. Sure, it might seem like a great expense, but concrete and steel are relatively inexpensive building materials. But what does this do to the nature of the building? Are we going to have the rich wooden library of days gone by? No. We're going to have hard tile, brick, exposed ceiling. We've even given up trying to cover up the building and are simply embracing steel and concrete. And that may be fine, but what does that say about a building's owner's respect for the customer, for its clientele? Restaurants are noisy. The rooms reverb and are very echoey, and it's hard to get your own little piece of privacy while you're trying to enjoy the ambience of a space. So, in 500 years, when our power has fallen and people look back at our architecture, what will they learn about us? What will they see that we value? Will they see that we valued safety, that we valued strength, or that we valued economy, and that we were trying to get by and squeeze the last dime out of every stone? I want you to go back through some of these pictures, look at some of these buildings and these spaces, and realize that just looking at the picture is not the same as being there. In order to really, truly, fully appreciate architecture and the effect that it has on our bodies, we have to go into these spaces. So, when we meet up for class next, we'll meet in our classroom, and then we'll take off and we'll take a small architectural tour of our very own campus. We'll look at some of the buildings and we'll try to interpret them and see, how do they read? What do they represent? And what do they communicate to the people who are in them and use them every day?